Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Colonel Austin Bay.
Jim, we talked about Ukraine about a month or so ago. Talked about how it was stalemated. I mean, is there any chance that this is going to be able to become quote unquote unstalemated? Are we going to end up with the situation where everything is status quo once they come to the peace negotiating table?
North Korea and South Korea.
Say that again.
Like North Korea and South. Yeah. Well, the Russians have expressed some interest in that. Ukraine is less enthusiastic. But there's another aspect to the war there where the Ukrainians are winning, and that's the war at sea. They had defeated the Russian Black Sea Fleet. They destroyed about a third of the ships. Now, you got to remember, Ukraine does not have a fleet in the classic sense. What they have are these USVs, unmanned surface vessels. And there's a new generation that were revealed, this year, the 2024 models. But these are basically unmanned surface vessels. Most of them carry explosives, so they're if they find a target, they'll attack it. They already sank, about 14, 15 Russian ships, and they've basically driven the Russian Black Sea Fleet as far away from the Western Black Sea as they can possibly get. And even then, they're basically stuck in a port far, far away from Crimea and Odessa for fear of these longer-range USVs hunting them down and destroying them. So this is a radical new weapon. And already, the Russian Navy is figuring out how could they possibly counter it. And Western navies are thinking the same thing. They say, well, if the Ukrainians can develop this technology, why not the Iranians? Why not any number of other people, and the North Koreans? We can have a whole new level of naval warfare going on with this new weapon. But so far, the Ukrainians have demonstrated that it is devastating. And it's long range. It's cheap, much cheaper than a ship. And, the cheapest warship out there is like $50-60 million. That's where, Russian corvette or frigate. American destroyers go for about $500 million. And other navies, are somewhere in between. But basically, destroyers, corvettes, frigates are all expensive ships. And now they have to face a very inexpensive opponent who is more likely to win than to lose.
Austin, I know you've written about this. What have you seen happening there in the Black Sea?
Well, Jim described it to a T. It's these unmanned surface vessels, and then they also, you see the term unmanned underwater vessels, UUVs. But when you think about it, though, a torpedo is sort of an unmanned. It is.
Yeah.
It is just like a kamikaze was a manned cruise missile. A cruise missile is an unmanned kamikaze. Written about it. Actually, most recent column was looking at two ways that Ukraine's already won, and understand that strategy page has been covering what's going on in the Black Sea from the get-go. I mean, we did jumped on it right after the Moskva was sunk by those improved Neptune cruise missiles that was April of 2022. With a longer range cruise missile, 20th century technology that the Ukrainians had juiced a little bit, but used, it turned out, a drone screen of small drones to confuse the Moscow's sensors, radars, and the like, and then the two of the missiles hit and sunk the cruiser. It was a huge political victory as well as a naval victory, because it was the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. I mean, a guided missile cruiser of with a heck of a lot of firepower. Now, part of the reason they had to withdraw on that or pull back besides the cruise missiles is a failure of Russian air power to gain anything better than air parity. Sometimes not even that over land in Ukraine, because of the surface-to-air missile threat, and in some cases to add on the anti-aircraft artillery. And part of that is Russian failure to be able to handle attack packages of aircraft, more than 4 or 5 aircraft. They just can't seem to be able to control it, as versus NATO can control 500, 600 planes in a raid if it wanted to. But that it was the lack of air cover is something that adds to increases the effectiveness of these unmanned surface vessels, because if you had a helicopter screen or a drone screen or aircraft screen, you're going to have a better be able to detect some of these unmanned craft further away from the ship, the target ship, or the dock facilities, because the Ukrainians have used them in Sevastopol and a couple of other smaller ports in Crimea, and also on a port on the eastern side of the in Russia proper of the Black Sea. So they've used it on support facilities for the Navy, and this has gotten, even though I bring in a strategy page there. You've seen it covered. I have U.S. Naval Institute and a few other places in the informed defense press, but it largely goes unnoticed by most media that the Ukraine has had this tremendous victory. Understand that Russia thought it was going to seal off the coast and deny Ukraine the ability to ship grain. Of course, one of the big things coming out of it, and that really came out after the Russians realized they were losing ships, was that Black Sea grain initiative that Turkey brokered to give a corridor for Ukraine to bring ships essentially from Odessa down to the Bosporus, and then from there on to the global sea lanes. But again, the Russians had already failed, which was one of the reasons they let the Turks negotiate it. Of course, there were a couple of other things going on there. Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey were all ticked off at all the sea mines, that both Ukrainian and Russian sea mines that were floating out in the Black Sea, and Turkey and Bulgaria especially spent a lot of time sweeping these mines up. That was not good for either Ukraine or Russia. But Russia's failure at sea and failure at air has given Ukraine sea access for its freighters. The route now, though, comes out of Odessa and then slips through Romanian and Bulgarian seacoast. It's within their 12-mile limit, and then it comes in and enters the Bosporus and Turkey, so that they're even avoiding open seas. But at the same time, the one threat that they've got is Russia has, Jim may correct me on this, I think a half dozen or 5 submarines left in the Black Sea, but they're going to start losing those now that the Swedes have given. This is what I think is going to happen. Now that the Swedes have given the Ukrainians one of their newer torpedoes is especially good for shallow water operation, and they can launch it from this particular torpedo from a land launcher or from a helicopter. And so there aren't going to be any Russian submarines in the Black Sea either. Again, major victory has a lot to do with maintaining economic viability, and so they won that. The other thing I don't want to get ahead on it, but then that column was Russia suffered a huge political strategic defeat when you have Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and the other kicker is Switzerland and Austria want to join the Sky Shield initiative that European countries have, that is a air and space defense organization. So they can get, it's really a missile defense for Europe, and it's tied, absolutely tied to North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though you don't have Canada and the United States as official members of it. But you've got Switzerland, all-time leading neutral, now saying, we know who the real enemy is. It's Russia.
So will Ukraine be able to use this victory in the Black Sea, Jim, to help them at the negotiating table if they get there?
Well, yes, because as long as the Ukrainian USVs are active, the Black Sea fleet cannot operate in the Black Sea. They're in distant waters. The Sea of Azov, the Black Sea in the east goes on for over 1,000 kilometers. And that's where the Russians are hiding out, so the remaining ships of the Black Sea fleet. And even then, these Ukrainian USVs, they have new models that even have longer range, can remain stationary. In other words, they can go to low power mode and just sit there. I don't know for how long. It could be for weeks or months. And if the Russians become active, these things are activated. The American satellite surveillance photos are passed on to Ukraine on a regular basis, and the Ukrainians have other ways of detecting activity in the far reaches of the Black Sea. So the Russians are basically stuck. And you can also bring up the fact that these USVs, which are very cheap, they could be used by Taiwan against China. Taiwan could send out 1,000 of these things if you have them standing ready, as it were, in bunkers, and then release them. They go out underwater. The Chinese can drop bombs on the water and what have you. Use their guns just to basically hit various mirages of the water, hoping they'll disable some of them. But it's a very expensive way to try and knock these things out because they're almost invisible. At night, they are invisible. They're low in the water. Austin pointed this out. Basically, some of them are, there was one model that is basically submerged. It's got a little, a thin little conning tower, as it were, but it's very thin, It's a couple of centimeters around.
They call it a semi-submersible.
Yeah. And basically, that is almost impossible to spot even during daylight. And the worst part of it is these things are cheap. These are not expensive systems. Like I was saying, Taiwan, if there's ever Chinese have to rethink how they're going to invade, because the Taiwanese could release 1,000 of these things into the straits of the Taiwanese straits between Taiwan and China, and the Chinese wouldn't be able to see them. They wouldn't know they're there until their ships started getting hit. These things come in at the waterline level. The first thing they do is, immobilize the ship. In other words, starts taking on water. If it hits them in the rear, bang, there goes the engine, the propeller. These things are deadly. And the Taiwanese or the Ukrainians can have thousands of them. Like I say, they're relatively cheap. You can keep them in storage. Doesn't take much. You dry them out. Keep the batteries, recharged, as it were, ready. You can just, it's done, so you just pop in a battery when you're ready to use them and let them go. And you release so many of these things that, they're eventually going to, make contact with whatever ships are coming their way and destroy them. So like I say, this is a nightmare for the Chinese. I don't know what they're going to do. They may be coming up with tactics as we speak, because they have to now fit that into their attack plan on Taiwan. Anybody else who's thinking of any naval warfare has to realize that their opponent doesn't need a traditional navy. All they need is 1,000 or so of these USVs, and bingo, they're the ultimate naval defensive weapon. Offensive, nothing much going on. I mean, yeah, you can basically equip some of them with explosives, and I think Austin mentioned this in passing, and you can sneak them into a anchorage and blow things up. And of course, that Swedish torpedo, which you can basically launch from a land-based unit, that basically gives you an anti-submarine warfare by air, because they can be launched from the helicopter or land. Because, and of course at sea, ships, but they've always been there. But you don't want to risk your ships. Indeed, don't have to risk your ships. You've got these Swedish torpedoes coming from the air or from land launches, and then you've got these USVs all over the place. So it's revolutionized naval warfare. I haven't seen anything from the U.S. Navy yet, because anybody, can basically build these things. The Iranians are a good example, because they go out there and selectively sink ships in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and do deliberate sabotage of the oil exports. In other words, Iranian oil would go out. They leave all Iranian ships alone, but they basically selectively hit everybody else's, or as they like to put it, anybody associated with Israel, which basically includes most of the West European countries by their reckoning. So this is a revolution in naval warfare, and it's only a matter of time before articles start being written. I think a lot of traditional naval experts have a hard time getting their heads around this. What is going on? Well, just ask the Russians, because it's been going on with them, and they've been losing, over a dozen ships, and they basically evacuated the Black Sea Fleet to distant waters where, even their caliber cruise missiles, sort of like the Tomahawk, are useful because they haven't got the range, and they can't use any other weapons. Their artillery, their 76 millimeter guns, anything else on the ship, all they left is cruise missile carriers, and that could be nullified as well, because the Ukrainians knock a lot of those down with their air defense missiles. In fact, the Ukrainians are now getting a new shipment of Patriot missiles, which will take out high-speed ballistic missiles, as well as traditional aircraft, so the offense is taking a beating, as the Russians can tell you, which is fine. NATO was a defensive organization, so NATO was good with all these systems. It's easier to defend. I mean, it basically puts any Russian control in the Baltic Sea at risk. I mean, even now, most of the Baltic states, most of the Baltic Sea seashore is now controlled by NATO countries. So already, the Russians have a problem up in the Baltic. And of course, these USVs can be launched from Norwegian ports up by where the Northern Fleet anchorage is, and basically blockade the Northern Fleet. The Pacific Fleet out by Vladivostok, it's a reach. But again, these things can be released from anywhere at any time, and basically block the airport, or after first sinking any stray ships were at sea. You can't see them. You really can't fight them. You basically got to run away and hope you're fast enough and got a place to go that isn't guarded by these little buggers. So, like I say, revolution in naval warfare.
But let me point something out on this, Dan. Is the weapon, the unmanned surface
USV.
vessels and the like, they're useful in what we'd call closed seas, and the Black Sea is that, and now the Baltic is for the Russians as well, and the Taiwan Strait has some characteristics of it, because there's essentially a choke point or something that can be closed off, and then you can use these unmanned vessels to pick off any enemy surface vessels. Even like you can even use them in some ways, I think, against submarines. There's some designs for that. Where you've got them essentially held in a specific area, and right now it's the sea. It's not the Russian Black Sea fleet; it's the Russian Sea of Azov fleet. Is basically where they've got them. Well, it is, Jim.
As far away as you can get from the Black Sea proper.
I mean that they're back up there. I think that these unmanned vessels, their efficacy once you move to the high seas, especially if you're taking on a fleet like the U.S. Navy that has air and space coverage, as well as submarine coverage and the like, you'll catch most of them. You might even come close to catching all of them, even though there's some of these models are all composites, so that they've got a low acoustic signature and the like. So I'm not putting them down. Jim's right. It is revolutionary, but if there are ways to stop it, and the ways you stop it is you have what I'll call it an all arms, combined arms fleet like the U.S. has. I think you'd also be able to produce a defensive type screen of unmanned vessels to deal with them. Here's the new idea. Well, here's a counter. But China's problem is it's got to break out. Russia's problem is it's got to break out, and we're back to a situation of the continental powers versus the maritime powers. It's you got to break out, and the Swedish torpedo, Type 47, isn't that yeah, all right, yeah. It as I understand it, I mean, what I've read about it, this thing is designed by the Swedes to kill Russian submarines coming into the Baltic, trying to get out of St. Petersburg, even Kaliningrad, and its characteristics are just perfect for what Sweden and Finland and Norway and Denmark and Poland and the Balts want if they're going to deal with Russian submarines. And it's essentially Ukraine now has the latest technology for dealing with Russian diesel and I'm sure nuclear submarines as well. Jim mentioned up there the Kola Peninsula and down at Archangel where the Northern Fleet is. I think you could bottle the Northern Fleet up with
because there's a strange waterway, the Bering Straits.
Yeah. And then they got to break out. But then their problem in the Cold War was always going through the big gap, Britain, Iceland, Greenland. And we were going to cover that by air and with submarines. And, come on, even though that's the Russian Navy touted itself, they didn't have the air cover to pull it off. The only way they could pull it off was with attacking submarines and doing something similar to what the Germans did World War I, World War II. But now they're the Ukrainians have shown how to bottle the Russians up, and the Russians are facing something. I'm sorry, the geography, topography. You're a continental power, and you've got all those resources, and you got Siberia. Same thing going for China. You got all that, but now if you want to break out maritime-wise, you're going to have to go through all these. All the islands, the island chains, and guess what? You're going to be running into all these unmanned underwater vessels and unmanned semi-submersible vessels, and they'll be covered by drones. And there, as Jim keeps saying, big point, they're inexpensive compared to what it takes, or what you've got in the investment in a huge surface fleet.
Yeah, I guess with China, China's got to be concerned about the other nations like the Philippines, Vietnam.
Vietnam's going to build these things, man.
Yeah. So it really is a revolution, Jim, like you say, and we'll continue to follow this.
Dan, let me make one point. I mean, the big thing, the question here, I was talking about the strategic loss, with everybody saying, hey, wait a minute, Russia's back to being bad again, and suddenly everybody else, even the Swiss, are interested in saying, we know whose side we're really on. All right, they won a naval victory. The one on land is stalemated. As the way Jim says it, it's a war of attrition, and if it continues the way it is now, Russia is willing to has the ability to continue to take all the casualties. The thing is, we're going to see what this new tranche of weapons does for Ukraine. And big factor on this, and we can do this on another podcast, is they're finally going to be getting F-16s. And that was the missing component in their 2023 counteroffensive. You really need air if you're going to be moving a combined arms army, and didn't have it.
Do you know when those F-16s come online?
Now, in small numbers. But really, you need hundreds of them to make a difference, and that's something that gets mentioned. Because the Ukrainians have already lost about over 300 fixed-wing aircraft and about the same number of helicopters. So they have a lot of replacement slots to fill, and it'll take a while. Now, the Russians have taken equal losses, and the Russian economy, because of all the economic sanctions, is not able to build replacements. So they're having a tough time. They've lost a lot of aircraft. In fact, I'm working on a piece now for Strategy Page. They have had over 24 instances where Russian aircraft were shot down by Russian air defense systems, and Russian aircraft bombed Russian targets. This is the gang that can't shoot straight. But
well, I just saw something where during some of the stuff that was going on in the Black Sea, that the Russian shore facilities opened up on one of their naval ships, and so they were shooting. It was a blue on blue type situation,
or red on red in this case. Something else to keep in mind is the Russians are losing the capacity to keep this war going. They've been running a war economy in a sanctions regime, the worst possible situation. They can't pile on as much as they want and produce new replacement equipment. They lost more tanks. I mean, they're using tanks, T-52s and T-62s, taken out of the reserves. They keep a lot of stuff forever, and here's where it's sort of paying off. But these are junk tanks. I mean, the best they're good for is artillery, infantry support, so for soft guns. And the Russians just can't replace all this stuff. I mean, they haven't got the manufacturing capability. They're not going to get it back because they can't get around the sanctions. The Chinese aren't going to help, and the Chinese don't want to get involved. And the Chinese told the Russians this is a stupid idea. So the Chinese are just as well. I feel that, all right, let them hang out and dry, take a beating, and they'll listen to us next time. God knows what they'll say next time.
Or maybe they'll give us Siberia. I mean,
well, yeah, they have the Chinese have a lot of. I think I did a piece on that. The Chinese have how should I put it? Disputed territories in the Far East, including Vladivostok, and the Russians have already entered into discussions about giving some of that land back. I think they've already returned small portions, but China is interested in the big portions. So there you go. Russia is fighting a losing battle. Even its friends aren't helping.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. We'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Okay, in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.